In the darkest days of World War II, as the Allies prepared for the final, brutal push into Nazi-occupied Europe, a secret weapon was unleashed. It wasn't a new tank, a faster plane, or a bigger bomb. It was an army of artists, actors, and engineers. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. Imagine this: you're a German soldier, peering through your binoculars across a field in France. In the distance, you see the unmistakable silhouettes of Sherman tanks, dozens of them lined up and ready for battle. You hear the rumble of their engines, the clank of their treads. You'll radio back to headquarters, reporting a massive American armored division preparing to attack. But what if I told you those tanks were made of rubber, inflatable decoys, weighing only 90 pounds each, that could be pumped up in minutes? The sounds you heard were broadcast from giant speakers mounted on trucks, playing recordings of military maneuvers captured miles away. This was the work of the Ghost Army. Their mission, cloaked in the highest levels of secrecy, was a masterpiece of deception. While real Allied units moved under the cover of darkness, the Ghost Army would arrive in their place, creating a phantom force to draw enemy attention. They were masters of illusion, using a combination of visual, sonic, and radio deception to fool the German high command. Their arsenal included not just inflatable tanks and artillery, but also fake aircraft, phony radio traffic, and even costumed soldiers who would stroll into French towns posing as officers from non-existent divisions, spreading misinformation in local cafes and bars. The unit was a fascinating mix of talent, specifically recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, and sound engineering studios across America. These weren't your typical soldiers. Among them were future fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, and photographer Art Kane. They were creative minds tasked with the ultimate artistic challenge, painting a false picture of war. They called their operations spoofing, and they became incredibly good at it. They would create entire fake command posts, complete with imitation, telegraph signals, and phony messages designed to be intercepted by German intelligence. One soldier's job was to simply drive a truck in circles, leaving tracks to suggest the recent movement of a large convoy. It was a war of perception, fought with creativity and cunning instead of brute force. Let's break down their methods. The visual deception was handled by the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. These were the artists and designers who created and deployed the inflatable army. They could set up a dummy airfield overnight or make a battalion of tanks appear out of thin air. They paid meticulous attention to detail. They knew that an armored division wouldn't just sit silently, so they made sure their fake encampments looked lived in, with fake laundry lines and simulated vehicle tracks. Then there was the sonic deception, run by the 3132 Signal Service Company. These sound experts had a library of recordings covering everything from the construction of pontoon bridges to the rumbling of tank columns. They would haul massive 500-pound speakers into position, often just a few miles from the front lines, and blast these sounds toward the enemy, creating the auditory illusion of a massive military buildup. They could tailor the sounds to specific scenarios, making it seem like a division was arriving, digging in, or preparing to move out. The psychological impact on German soldiers hearing an army on the move just over the hill must have been immense. Finally, there was the radio deception. The signal company would mimic the radio traffic of a real military unit. Each division had a unique fist or style of sending Morse code. The Ghost Army operators learned to perfectly imitate these styles. They would broadcast fake messages, creating a web of false information for German radio intercept operators. This convinced the enemy that a specific, real division was located in one area, when in reality, it was secretly maneuvering for an attack somewhere else entirely. From the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine River, the Ghost Army conducted more than 20 battlefield deceptions. Their most famous operation was codenamed Viersen. In March 1945, the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine, a formidable natural barrier. The real crossing was planned for a specific, heavily defended location. To draw German forces away, the Ghost Army was tasked with simulating a crossing by two entire divisions, about 30,000 men, at a different spot. 4 days, they blasted the sounds of bridge building and troop movements across the river. They inflated hundreds of dummy vehicles and set up fake command posts. The deception was so effective that it tied up German artillery and infantry, pulling them away from the actual crossing point. When the real Ninth Army attacked, they faced significantly less resistance, saving countless lives. The men of the Ghost Army operated in constant danger. To be convincing, their deceptions had to be close to the front lines, often within artillery range and in full view of the enemy. They were a small unit, usually no more than 1,100 men, but they were impersonating forces up to 30 times their size. If the Germans had discovered the ruse and attacked, the Ghost Army would have been catastrophically outmatched. They were armed only with their wits, their creativity, and a handful of 50 caliber machine guns for protection. Theirs was a high-stakes performance where a single mistake could have fatal consequences. For decades, their story remained classified. The men who served were sworn to secrecy, unable to tell even their families about their incredible contributions to the war effort. They returned home, stored their memories, and moved on with their lives. It wasn't until 1996 that the mission was finally declassified, and the world began to learn about this audacious and imaginative unit. These soldiers, now elderly men, could finally share their stories. Military historians estimate that the Ghost Army's deceptions saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. The legacy of the Ghost Army is a powerful reminder that warfare isn't just about firepower. It's also about strategy, intelligence, and psychology. It shows how creativity and ingenuity can be just as potent as any weapon. These soldiers prove that sometimes the most effective way to win a battle is to convince your enemy to fight an army that is even there. It was the ultimate con, played out on the world's deadliest stage by a group of artists who helped change the course of history. Ever heard of an army that fought with art instead of ammunition? Today, we redive in deep into the story of one of the most creative and bizarre units in military history, the Ghost Army of World War II. Their official name was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but their mission was anything but ordinary. They weren't there to fight in the traditional sense. Their job was to deceive, to trick the German army into believing American forces were somewhere they weren't. And how did they do it? With inflatable tanks, sound trucks, blasting battle noises, and fake radio chatter. It was a traveling roadshow of deception, designed to draw enemy fire and save thousands of American lives. What made the Ghost Army truly extraordinary wasn't just its mission, but its personnel. These weren't your typical soldiers. Many were recruited straight from art schools, advertising agencies, architecture firms, and sound studios across America. Imagine this. Instead of basic training focusing solely on marksmanship, you have soldiers learning how to paint camouflage that fools the eye from the air, or how to design inflatable tanks that look terrifyingly real from a distance. The unit was a melting pot of painters, graphic designers, sculptors, and audio engineers. These were creative minds whose skills were repurposed for the battlefield. Their canvas became the French countryside, their sculptures were rubber decoys, and their symphonies were the recorded sounds of advancing armor. Among these creative soldiers were names that would later become titans of the post-war American art and design world. Bill Blass, the legendary fashion designer, was there. So was Ellsworth Kelly, who would become a renowned minimalist painter and sculptor. Arturo Singer, who later became a famous wildlife artist, and Art Kane, the groundbreaking fashion and music photographer, also served in this unique unit. These individuals, and hundreds like them, used their artistic talents not to create gallery pieces, but to craft realistic battlefield illusions. Their work had to be convincing enough to mislead experienced German intelligence officers. It was a high-stakes game of smoke and mirrors, where a single, misplaced, inflatable, or an unconvincing sound effect could have disastrous consequences. Let's break down their toolkit. First, you had the visual deception. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers were the artists. They would roll into a designated area, often under the cover of darkness, and inflate a whole army of rubber tanks, cannons, and jeeps. From a reconnaissance plane, these decoys were indistinguishable from the real thing. They even paid attention to the smallest details, like creating fake tire tracks with special rollers to complete the illusion of a massive force that had just arrived. They'd hang laundry on clotheslines between tanks to suggest the presence of soldiers. It was stagecraft on a grand scale. The goal was to make a small unit look like a division of 30,000 men. Then there was the sonic deception. handled by the 3132nd Signal Service Company. These were the audio engineers and sound effects wizards. They had a library of recordings made at Fort Knox, capturing every sound of a real armored and infantry division. They had recordings of tanks moving, soldiers shouting commands, and pontoon bridges being built. They would mount massive speakers on the backs of half-tracks and blast these sounds across the countryside, sometimes up to 15 miles away. At night, a German soldier listening from a forward post would hear what sounded like an entire American armored division assembling for an attack, causing panic and forcing the German command to reposition their troops to face a non-existent threat. Completing the illusion was radio deception. The signal company would mimic the radio traffic of the real units they were impersonating. Each division had a unique signature in its radio transmissions the specific way. Operators keyed their Morse code, their conversational tics, their patterns of communication. The Ghost Army operators meticulously studied and replicated these patterns. They would create a web of phony radio chatter, fooling German intelligence into thinking a specific, well-known American division was operating in their sector, when in reality that division was miles away, preparing for a real attack in secret. This spoof radio was crucial for making the deception believable and complete. Their missions were incredibly dangerous. While they weren't expected to engage in direct combat, they were often positioned on the front lines, sometimes deliberately drawing enemy artillery fire to sell their illusion. They were a small unit, usually just over 1,000 men, impersonating forces up to 30 times their size. If the Germans ever discovered the ruse, they would be a very small, very vulnerable target. Imagine being in a field surrounded by rubber tanks when real artillery shells start raining down. The courage it took to hold your position, to continue the deception while under fire, is just astounding. They had to be not only creative artists, but also brave soldiers. One of their most famous operations was Operation V, which took place in March 1945. The U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River, a major strategic objective. The Ghost Army was tasked with creating a diversion. They set up their inflatable army and sound trucks miles south of the actual crossing point. For 2 days, they blasted the sounds of an army preparing for a major assault. They created so much fake radio traffic that German intelligence was completely convinced the attack was coming from their location. This deception drew an entire German panzer division away from the real crossing site, allowing the Ninth Army to cross the Rhine with minimal casualties. It's estimated this single act of deception saved thousands of lives. The story of the Ghost Army was classified for more than 40 years after the war. These soldiers, these artists and creators, returned home and were sworn to secrecy. They couldn't talk about their inflatable tanks or their sound effects battles. Bill Blass went on to build a fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly became a celebrated artist. But their most creative and impactful work remained a state secret. They quietly blended back into civilian life, their incredible contributions unknown to the public. It wasn't until the 1990s that the mission was declassified, and their stories began to emerge. It's a powerful reminder that warfare isn't just about brute force. It's also about psychology, creativity, and ingenuity. The Ghost Army proved that a well-placed idea, a convincing illusion, could be as powerful as a battalion of tanks. They used their artistic talents to manipulate the enemy's perception of reality to control the narrative of the battlefield. They were masters of misdirection, turning art into a weapon and saving lives in the process. Their legacy is not just in the battles they influenced, but in the unique way they fought them. They were the artists of war. Finally, in February 2022, the Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. It was a long overdue recognition for the handful of surviving veterans and the memory of all who served. Their story is a testament to the power of unconventional thinking and the incredible bravery of the men who wielded creativity as their primary weapon. It's a chapter of World War II history that feels like it's straight out of a Hollywood movie, but it was all very real. Have you ever heard of an army that fought its battles, not with bullets and bombs, but with balloons and sound effects? It sounds like something out of a movie, but this was the very real, very secret, and very effective tactic of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. During World War II, this unique unit of the United States Army had one mission: to deceive the enemy, and they did it with a level of creativity and theatrical flair that is truly mind-blowing. Their most famous and visually striking tools were their inflatable decoys. Imagine this: a group of just a few soldiers arriving at an empty field in France and, within hours, transforming it into what looks like a staging ground for a massive armored division. How did they do it? With inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even airplanes. These weren't your average pool floats. They were life-sized, meticulously designed replicas made from rubberized canvas. From a distance, or more importantly, from the reconnaissance planes flying overhead, these rubber armies were indistinguishable from the real thing. Let's break down how sophisticated these decoys really were. An M4 Sherman tank, a 32-ton beast of steel, could be replicated by a rubber version that weighed only 90 pounds. For soldiers could pick it up and move it around, creating the illusion of a tank repositioning. Think about the logistical genius of this. A convoy of real tanks is slow, loud, and consumes enormous amounts of fuel. An entire battalion of inflatable tanks could be packed into a couple of trucks and deployed rapidly anywhere the Allied command wanted the Germans to think. They were massing their forces. The soldiers of the Ghost Army were masters of stage. It wasn't enough to just plop a few rubber tanks in a field. They had to create a complete, believable scene. They would use bulldozers or even just their own feet to create fake tank tracks in the dirt, leading to and from the decoy positions, mimicking the constant movement of a real unit. They'd scatter empty fuel cans, hang laundry on clotheslines, and set up fake command posts. They even simulated the mundane details of army life, creating the impression of thousands of soldiers camped out, waiting for the order to attack. This was a high-stakes performance. The soldiers, many of whom were artists, designers, and sound engineers recruited from art schools and AD agencies, had to think like a set decorator for the world's most dangerous play. Every detail mattered. The positioning of the decoys, the patterns of the tracks, even the simulated garbage left behind. It all had to be perfect. A single mistake, a single detail that seemed out of place to a German spy plane could give the whole game away, not only endangering the Ghost Army itself, but also jeopardizing the real military operations they were trying to protect. The inflatable army was just one part of their arsenal of deception. They combined these visual tricks with sonic deception. Using powerful speakers mounted on trucks, they could blast pre-accorded sounds of rumbling tanks, soldiers shouting commands, and the clatter of construction. They could make a small convoy sound like an entire armored division on the move, or a quiet patch of woods sound like a bustling engineering corps building bridges. They also used radio deception, mimicking the traffic of a real unit to further sell the lie. This multi-sensory approach UER made their illusions incredibly convincing. One of their most significant operations was called Operation V. In March 1945, as the Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine River into Germany, a critical and dangerous maneuver, the Ghost Army was tasked with a crucial deception. The real crossing was planned by the Ninth Army at a specific location. The Ghost Army's job was to draw German attention and forces away from that spot. They set up their entire spectacle of inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, and sonic wizardry about 10 miles south of the real crossing point. For 2 days, they put on the show of a lifetime. They simulated the arrival of 2 full armored divisions, complete with all the sights and sounds. They inflated over 600 vehicles. The sonic trucks blared the sounds of troop movements and bridge building all night long. The goal was to convince the Germans that a massive attack was imminent at this fake location. And it worked. German intelligence picked up on the build-up and diverted significant artillery and troop resources to counter the phantom threat. This left the actual crossing point for the Ninth Army far less defended, saving countless Allied lives and helping to ensure the success of a pivotal moment in the war. The men of the Ghost Army were in constant danger. They were often operating very close to the front lines, deliberately drawing enemy fire to make their deception more believable. They were a small unit, usually numbering just over 1,000 men. The story of the Ghost Army was classified for more than 40 years after the war ended. The soldiers who served in this unique unit went home and rarely spoke of their experiences, bound by secrecy. Their incredible contributions to the war effort, their ingenuity, and their courage remained unknown to the public for decades. It's only in recent years that their story has been declassified and come to light, earning them the recognition they so rightly deserve, including a Congressional Gold Medal. It's a powerful reminder that warfare isn't just about brute force. It's also a battle of minds, a game of chess played on a massive scale. The Ghost Army proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a cannon, but an idea. The ability to fool your enemy, to make them look left when you're going right, can be just as decisive as any battle. So next time you see a bouncy castle, maybe you think of those brave artists and engineers who wielded inflatable armies and helped change the course of history. So, how did they do it? They didn't just have guys banging pots and pans together. This was a highly sophisticated, almost Hollywood-level production. They had a special sonic deception unit, and their primary tool was a series of powerful speakers, some weighing up to 500 pounds, mounted on the back of half-track vehicles. These weren't your average loudspeakers. These things were beasts, capable of projecting sound with incredible clarity and volume. On a clear, quiet night, the sounds they played could be heard up to 15 miles away. Imagine being a German soldier, huddled in a foxhole, and hearing the unmistakable roar of an entire armored division moving just over the horizon. That's the kind of psychological impact we're talking about. The real genius, though, was in what they played. They couldn't just use generic sound effects. The audio had to be authentic. So, the Army brought in sound engineers from top Hollywood studios to record actual U.S. military units during their training exercises. They captured everything. The clatter of tank treads, the rumble of truck engines, the shouts of soldiers, the rhythmic hammering of engineers building a pontoon bridge, even the distinct sounds of different types of artillery being fired and reloaded. They built an entire library of deception, a symphony of war that they could conduct at will. These recordings were then edited and mixed onto state-of-the-art wire recorders, the predecessor to magnetic tape. The sonic team could then create elaborate audio scripts. They wouldn't just play one sound on a loop. Oh no, that would be too simple and easily detected. Instead, they would mix different tracks together to create a dynamic, evolving soundscape. They could simulate a column of tanks arriving, stopping, the soldiers dismounting and setting up camp, and then the column moving out again hours later. They could even mimic the sounds of a unit getting into a skirmish. Let's walk through a typical mission. Imagine a scenario where the Allies want the Germans to believe a large infantry and armored force is massing at a specific point along the front line, perhaps to draw enemy troops away from the real attack location, under the cover of darkness. A few half-tracks from the sonic unit would cautiously drive to a designated area, maybe a few miles from the German lines. They would set up their speakers, carefully positioning them to maximize the acoustic effect, using the natural landscape like hills and valleys to channel the sound. Then, the show would begin. The sound engineers, who were often just a handful of men, would start playing their pre-recorded tracks. They might begin with a distant rumble of trucks, gradually increasing the volume to simulate an approaching convoy. Then, they'd layer in the unique clanking and squealing of Sherman tanks. You'd hear commands being shouted, the sounds of men digging in, maybe even some light-hearted chatter or singing to add a touch of realism. The entire performance was carefully timed. For example, sounds of bridge construction would be played near a river, making the enemy believe a crossing was imminent. They had to think about everything, even the time of day. Certain sounds were more common at night, others during the day. The level of detail was simply astounding. The psychological effect on the German soldiers was profound. They would report hearing massive enemy movements. Their intelligence officers would piece together these reports with sightings of the Ghost Army's inflatable tanks and planes, and suddenly a phantom army became a very real threat in their minds. German commanders would divert precious, resourcey troops, artillery, reconnaissance planes to counter a threat that didn't actually exist. They were literally chasing ghosts, and every soldier and every tank they moved to counter the fake army was one less soldier and one less tank available to fight the real one. One of the most famous examples of their sonic deception was during Operation V, just before the massive Allied push across the Rhine River in March 1945. The goal was to convince the Germans that the Ninth Army was going to cross the Rhine near Düsseldorf, while the actual crossing was planned further north. The Ghost Army was brought in to sell the lie. 4 days, the sonic unit blasted the sounds of an entire division getting ready for an assault. They played recordings of artillery bombardments, of amphibious vehicles being prepared, and of thousands of troops moving into position. The deception was so convincing that the Germans heavily reinforced their defenses opposite the Phantom Army, leaving the real crossing point dangerously undermanned. When the Allies finally launched their real attack, they met far less resistance than they otherwise would have, saving countless lives. What's also incredible is who these sonic wizards were. They weren't necessarily lifelong soldiers. The unit was filled with sound engineers, radio operators, architects, and artists recruited for their specific skills. They were creative problem solvers who had to think on their feet. If a piece of equipment broke down, they had to fix it in the field, often just miles from the enemy. They had to understand acoustics, meteorology, how wind and weather would affect their sound, and enemy psychology. They were a unique blend of artist and soldier, using sound waves as their weapon. Think about the sheer bravery involved. A small team of men would drive a truck full of speakers close to the front lines, deliberately make a huge amount of noise to attract the enemy's attention, and then just sit there, hoping the Germans would be fooled and not just shell their position into oblivion. They were painting a huge target on their backs every single night, and sometimes the Germans did fire back. The sonic troopers were in constant danger, relying on their wits and the quality of their deception to survive. The combination of visual deception with this sophisticated sonic warfare created a multisensory illusion that was incredibly difficult for the enemy to dismiss. Seeing a few rubber tanks might raise suspicion, but seeing those tanks and also hearing the sounds of a full armored battalion setting up camp, that's a different story. It made the fake seem real. The Ghost Army proved that in modern warfare, the battle for the enemy's mind is just as important as the battle on the ground. Their work in sound deception was a secret masterpiece, a critical component of one of the most brilliant and unconventional units in military history. Have you ever thought about how powerful a simple radio signal can be? In the world of deception, it can be the difference between victory and defeat. The Ghost Army knew this better than anyone, and their use of radio warfare was nothing short of genius. It was a symphony of lies, conducted over the airwaves, and the Germans were the unsuspecting audience. Picture this. Deep in the English countryside, in a hidden bunker, a small team of highly skilled radio operators are hard at work. They aren't just sending random messages, they're performing. Each operator has studied the communication style of a specific, real U.S. Army unit. They know their quirks, their slang, the rhythm of their Morse code. They can perfectly mimic the fist of a particular telegraph unique, almost like a signature way they tap out their messages. These weren't just any operators. They were the best of the best, hand-picked for their skill and precision. Their mission was to create a phantom army out of thin air, an army that existed only as electrical pulses traveling through the ether. They would send out a flurry of signals, creating the illusion of a massive force preparing to strike. Messages about troop movements, supply requests, even mundane daily chatter, all of it was fabricated, designed to paint a vivid, but completely false, picture for German intelligence. The Germans, for their part, were masters of signals intelligence. They had listening posts all along the French coast, their ears pressed firmly to the ground, so to speak. They relied heavily on intercepting Allied radio traffic to predict their next move, and the Ghost Army gave them exactly what they were listening for. The transmissions were so convincing, so detailed, that the German analysts had no reason to doubt them. They heard what they expected to hear from a large army group massing in a specific area. This radio deception was meticulously coordinated with the other parts of the Ghost Army's operation. When the inflatable tanks were moved at night, the radio traffic would reflect that. If a Phantom division was supposedly receiving new equipment, the airwaves would be filled with messages about logistical arrangements. It was a multi-layered illusion. The visual deception on the ground was reinforced by the auditory deception in the air. Let's dive a little deeper into how they pulled this off. The unit responsible for this magic was the 3132nd Signal Service Company Special. They had a library of recordings of actual unit communications. They could replicate the radio traffic of an entire division, with all its subordinate battalions and companies, using just a handful of men and a few trucks loaded with transmitters. They would set up their equipment in a field, broadcast for a few hours to establish the presence of a large unit, and then pack up and move to a new location, simulating the movement of that unit across the countryside. Imagine the German intelligence officer, hunched over his receiver. He picks up a signal. The call sign is familiar. The operator's Morse code style matches the records for, say, a signalman in Patton's Third Army. The message content a request for more fuel fits the pattern of an armored division preparing for a major offensive. He logs the report, cross-references it with other intercepts, and passes it up the chain of command. The information is solid, except it's not. The signal he just intercepted came from a lone truck in a field in Kent, miles away from where the real Third Army was. This wasn't a one-time trick. This was a continuous 24/7 performance that lasted 4 weeks. The radio operators had to live and breathe their fake identities. They created entire narratives. They'd broadcast messages about a baseball game being organized between 2 phantom battalions. They'd send fake personal letters full of gossip and complaints about the English weather, just like real soldiers would. This level of detail is what made the deception so incredibly effective. It made the Phantom Army feel real, feel human. The Germans took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. They directed their reconnaissance flights, their spies, and their military resources based on this false radio intelligence. They kept powerful panzer divisions waiting in the Pas-de-Calais region, anticipating an invasion that would never come, all because a few dozen men were playing make-believe on the radio. The real invasion force, meanwhile, was gathering in secret, preparing to land at Normandy. The psychological impact was enormous. The constant, convincing radio traffic created a sense of certainty in the minds of the German command. They believed they knew where the main Allied attack would happen. This certainty was their downfall. By controlling the information the Germans received, the Ghost Army controlled their perception of reality. They weren't just jamming signals, they were hijacking the enemy's entire decision-making process. It's a powerful lesson in the nature of modern warfare. It's not always about who has the biggest tanks or the most soldiers. Sometimes it's about who tells the most convincing story. The men of the 3132nd Signal Service Company were master storytellers. Their stage was the radio spectrum, and their performance saved countless lives by ensuring the success of the D-Day landings. It's a side of the war we rarely hear about, but it was absolutely crucial. The silent, invisible battle of the airwaves was won not with bombs, but with cleverness, skill, and a brilliantly executed lie. When you think of World War II heroes, you probably picture soldiers storming beaches or pilots in dogfights. But what about the heroes who fought with illusions? The ones whose weapons were inflatable tanks, sound effects, and pure imagination. Today, we're diving deep into the story of one of the most audacious, creative, and secretive units of the entire war. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. These weren't your typical soldiers. This unit was a hand-picked collection of artists, designers, sound engineers, actors, and advertising professionals. Their mission wasn't to fight, but to deceive. They were masters of illusion, tasked with creating phantom armies to fool the German high command. And they did it right on the front lines, often just a few miles from enemy positions, where the slightest mistake could be fatal. Their battlefield was the enemy's mind. Imagine this. A small group of just over 1,000 men creating the illusion of a massive force of 30,000. How did they pull it off? Their arsenal was unlike any other. They had a fleet of inflatable rubber tanks, jeeps, and artillery pieces. From the air, these decoys were indistinguishable from the real thing. On ground teams would use bulldozers to create fake tank tracks, adding another layer of realism to their elaborate stage play. They even had a name for it: spoof. But visual deception was only part of the equation. To truly sell the illusion, they needed sound. The Ghost Army's sonic deception unit was equipped with powerful speakers mounted on They had a whole library of meticulously recorded sounds: the rumble of advancing tank columns, the clatter of engineers building pontoon bridges, even the casual chatter of soldiers. They would blast these recordings across the landscape, often at night. making German listeners believe a huge Allied force was on the move. They could make a lonely valley sound like an entire armored division was rolling through. The third piece of the puzzle was radio deception. A special team of radio operators would mimic the communication patterns of a real military unit. They created fake traffic, sending and receiving coded messages that they knew German intelligence would intercept. By mimicking the distinct fist or typing style of different radio operators from units that were actually hundreds of miles away, they could convince the Germans that those units were present, reinforcing the illusion of a massive buildup of forces. And finally, there was the special effects or atmospheric component. Soldiers from the Ghost Army would visit nearby towns, dressed in the uniforms and insignia of the divisions they were impersonating. They'd casually drop hints in cafes and bars, knowing that local spies and sympathizers would report what they saw and heard. They were actors on a grand stage, playing the part of soldiers in a fictional army. One soldier might put on a divisional patch, stroll into a French village, have a glass of wine, and talk loosely about his unit's big upcoming push. This carefully crafted gossip would inevitably find its way to German intelligence. The Ghost Army operated close to the front lines, often just miles from German positions. They worked under constant risk if discovered they lacked the firepower to defend themselves. Their entire force had only a few machine guns. Their only real defense was their deception, yet their operations repeatedly succeeded. In one of their most famous missions, Operation Viersen, they drew an entire German panzer division away from a critical crossing point on the Rhine River, allowing the real Ninth Army to cross with minimal casualties. They created the illusion of a massive force preparing to cross the river, complete with inflatable boats, sonic effects of bridge building, and fake radio chatter. The Germans bought it completely, repositioning their forces to counter a threat that didn't exist. Their work was so secret that it was classified for more than 40 years after the war ended. The soldiers were sworn to secrecy, unable to tell even their families what they had done. They were the unsung heroes who fought a war of wits and imagination. They proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but an idea. By forcing German commanders to divert troops, delay attacks, or prepare defenses in the wrong locations, the Ghost Army saved countless Allied lives. Estimates suggest their actions saved anywhere from 15,000 to 30,000 lives. The men of the Ghost Army included future celebrities like fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, and photographer Art Kane. They were a unique blend of creativity and courage, using their artistic talents in the most high-stakes environment imaginable. Their story is a testament to the power of ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. It shows that warfare isn't just about brute force, it's also about strategy, psychology, and outthinking your opponent. The legacy of the Ghost Army lives on. Their techniques laid the groundwork for modern psychological operations and information warfare. They demonstrated that deception could be a powerful, life-saving tool on the battlefield. It's a side of World War II we rarely hear about, a story of phantom armies and the brilliant minds who commanded them. They fought with rubber and sound, and their bravery was in their ability to fool the enemy right under their noses. It wasn't until 1996 that their mission was declassified, and only in 2022 were the surviving members finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest honors. Their story is a powerful reminder that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes the greatest victories are won without firing a single shot. The Ghost Army may have been invisible during the war, but their incredible contribution to victory should never be forgotten. Have you ever heard of an army that fought with sound? Not swords. With illusions, not artillery. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most incredible stories of World War II. A tale of deception, creativity, and unbelievable bravery. This is the story of the Ghost Army. Imagine this. It's late 1944. The war in Europe seems to be winding down. Allied forces are pushing deep into enemy territory, and for many, the end feels near. But then, in the dense, snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, the unthinkable happens. On December 16th, Hitler launches a massive, last-ditch surprise attack. This is the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, one of the deadliest and most desperate battles of the war. The German offensive punches a massive bulge into the Allied lines. American forces are caught completely off guard, thinly spread and exhausted. They are outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a brutal winter. Panic begins to set in, the front line is collapsing, and the entire Allied advance is in jeopardy. It's a moment of absolute crisis. In teeth chows, when real tanks and real soldiers are in short supply, the Allies call upon their most unconventional unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. This wasn't your typical fighting force. It was a phantom unit, composed of artists, sound engineers, actors, and designers. Their mission: to deceive the enemy on an epic scale. They were masters of illusion, tasked with making 1,000 men look and sound like a full division of 15 to 20,000. Their arsenal wasn't filled with live ammunition. Instead, they wielded inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that looked astonishingly real from the air. They had powerful speakers that could blast the sounds of troop movements, tank columns, and bridge construction for miles. They even had a team of actors who would visit local towns, dressed as high-ranking officers, spreading false information and rumors for enemy spies to overhear. They were creating a traveling roadshow of war, a masterpiece of military theater designed to fool the German high command. Now, let's set the scene for their most critical performance. As the Battle of the Bulge rages, the Ghost Army is deployed to a particularly vulnerable section of the front line along the Meuse River. The Germans are pushing hard, and there's a real fear that could break through and split the Allied forces in two. Real reinforcements are stretched thin, racing to plug holes all along the massive front. Time is the most critical resource, and the Allies are running out of it. This is where our ghost soldiers step onto the stage. Their mission is to create the illusion that a powerful American division, the 75th Infantry, has arrived to fortify the line. In reality, the 75th is still miles away, desperately trying to get into position. The Ghost Army has to hold this fragile line with nothing but trickery. So, how did they do it? Under the cover of darkness, they began their elaborate deception. They rolled out their fleet of rubber tanks and carefully positioned them in fields and along roadsides, just visible enough to be spotted by German reconnaissance planes at dawn. From a distance, these inflatable decoys were indistinguishable from the real thing. To add another layer of realism, they even used tractors to create fake tank tracks in the mud and snow, making it look like a massive armored column had just moved through. But the visual illusion was only half the story. The sonic deception was just as important. The sound engineers, huddled in their specially equipped trucks, unleashed their symphony of war. They broadcast pre-recorded audio of Sherman tanks rumbling into position, the clatter and shouts of engineering units building pontoon bridges, and the distant chatter of thousands of soldiers. These sounds echoed through the valleys, convincing any German listening posts that a major American force was digging in for a fight. The sound was so convincing that it not only fooled the enemy, but also boosted the morale of the few real American soldiers holding the line, making them feel like a huge army had their back. The final piece of the puzzle was the Special Effects Unit. These soldiers specialized in what they called spoof radio. They mimicked the radio traffic of a real division headquarters, sending out a constant stream of coded messages and fake orders. German intelligence, listening in, would pick up this chatter and report back that a full American division was active in the area. It was a complete, multi-sensory illusion. For several crucial days, the Ghost Army held this phantom front line. They drew German attention and, more importantly, German artillery fire. Imagine being one of these soldiers, sitting in a field next to a rubber tank, while real shells explode around you. Their only defense was the strength of their illusion. They were buying precious, invaluable time, and it worked. The German commanders, convinced they were facing a massive, well-entrenched American division, hesitated. They diverted their forces, slowed their advance, and chose not to attack what they perceived to be a strong point. That hesitation was exactly what the real Allied forces needed. It allowed the exhausted American units to regroup, resupply, and for the actual 75th Division to finally arrive and take up their positions. By the time the Germans realized they had been tricked, the window of opportunity had closed. The line was stabilized. The Ghost Army had successfully plugged a critical gap in the Allied defenses using nothing but ingenuity and courage. Their actions at the Battle of the Bulge didn't just save a section of the front. They contributed significantly to halting the entire German offensive and turning the tide of the battle. At a moment when the war's outcome hung in the balance, these artists and engineers played a starring role. The story of the Ghost Army was kept top secret for more than 40 years after the war ended. These soldiers were sworn to secrecy, unable to tell even their families about their incredible exploits. They faded back into civilian life, their contributions unknown to the public they helped protect. It wasn't until the 1990s that their story was finally declassified, and the world began to learn about the Phantom Army that fought with creativity and wit. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that warfare isn't just about brute force. It's about strategy, intelligence, and sometimes the power of a good story. The Ghost Army proved that in the right hands, an inflatable tank and a loudspeaker can be just as mighty as a real weapon. They were the ultimate masters of misdirection, the unsung heroes who helped win the war by fooling the enemy. Ever heard of an army that fought with illusions? An army whose greatest weapons were sound trucks, inflatable tanks, and pure creative genius. Today, we're diving into the incredible true story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. These weren't your typical soldiers. They were artists, designers, and sound engineers, recruited for a top-secret mission to deceive the entire German military. Their battlefield was the human mind, and their victories were measured in lives saved. Formed in early 1944, this unique unit of just over 1,000 men was tasked with one of the most audacious deceptions of World War II. Their job was to impersonate entire U.S. Army divisions, creating the illusion of massive troop buildups where there were none. They were masters of misdirection, a traveling roadshow of deception designed to draw enemy forces away from real Allied operations. Imagine being a German reconnaissance pilot, flying over the French countryside. Below, you see what looks like a massive armored division getting ready to attack rows upon rows of Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, and fleets of trucks. You'd radio back to headquarters, warning of an imminent assault. But what you actually saw was a mirage, an army of rubber and air. The Ghost Army's primary tool was a collection of inflatable decoys. They had everything from M4 Sherman tanks and 155mm howitzers to GMC trucks and even airplanes. These weren't just crude balloons. They were meticulously crafted to look real from the air and from a distance. A crew of just 4 men could inflate an entire platoon of tanks in under half an hour. To complete the illusion, they'd even use a bulldozer to create fake tank tracks around the motor pool, making it look like the heavy vehicles had been moving around. It was a masterpiece of visual trickery, but sight was only one part of the equation. To truly sell the deception, they had to fool the enemy's ears as well. This is where the Sonic Deception Unit came in. They had a library of sound effects recorded on state-of-the-art wire recorders at Fort Knox. These weren't generic sounds. They were specific recordings of different types of units. They could mimic the sounds of an infantry division digging in for the night, or an armored column moving under the cover of darkness. They would mount massive speakers on half-tracks and blast these sounds for miles, creating an auditory ghost that was just as convincing as the visual one. German sound-ranging units would pick up these noises and report massive troop movements, completely unaware they were listening to a recording. The third piece of this elaborate puzzle was radio deception, or spoof radio. The Ghost Army's signal company would mimic the radio traffic of the division they were impersonating. They were masters of Morse code, and could even replicate the individual sending styles of different radio operators from the real units. They would send out fake messages, creating a web of chatter that made it seem like a command headquarters was active in the area. This digital ghost trail would be picked up by German intelligence, further cementing the belief that a large American force was present. And finally, there was the special effects component. To make the deception truly believable, the Ghost Army needed to create the atmosphere of a real division headquarters. Soldiers from the unit would put on the patches and insignia of the division they were faking. They'd drive jeeps and trucks into nearby towns, frequenting cafes and bars, and deliberately leaked false information about their unit's strength and upcoming plans. They'd even set up fake command posts, complete with a sham general who would make a conspicuous appearance. It was a level of method acting that would make Hollywood proud. While Operation Fortitude, the grand deception that fooled Hitler about the location of the D-Day landings, gets most of the credit, the Ghost Army's work was arguably just as crucial, especially in the weeks and months that followed. After the Allies landed in Normandy, they faced a brutal and bloody fight to break out from the beachheads. This is where the Ghost Army truly shined. One of their most significant operations was Operation Bedembourg. In September 1944, General Patton's Third Army was making a risky push toward the German city of Metz. A significant portion of his line was stretched dangerously thin, creating a 70-mile gap. If the Germans discovered this weakness, they could pour through and cut off Patton's forces. The Ghost Army was called in to plug this gap. Over several days, they used every trick in their book. They deployed their inflatable tanks, blasted their sonic deception, and filled the airwaves with fake radio traffic, all to create the illusion that the U.S. 6th Armored Division was holding the line. The deception worked perfectly. German intelligence believed a full-strength division was in front of them and hesitated to attack, giving Patton the crucial time he needed to reposition his real forces and secure the area. They performed over 20 similar deceptions across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Their final and perhaps most daring act was Operation Viersen in March 1945. The U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the heavily defended Rhine River. The Ghost Army was tasked with drawing German attention away from the real crossing point. They simulated 2 entire divisions, numbering around 30,000 men, preparing for a river crossing miles away from the actual location. They used their inflatable tanks, broadcast the sounds of bridge construction, and even set up dummy artillery batteries that simulated firing by using pyrotechnics. The deception was so convincing that it drew a German artillery division to their fake position, which then rained down shells on empty fields and rubber tanks. This allowed the real Ninth Army to cross the Rhine with far fewer casualties than anticipated. The amazing thing is that the existence of the Ghost Army was kept classified for more than 50 years after the war. The soldiers who served in this unit were sworn to secrecy. They couldn't tell their friends, their families, or even their fellow soldiers what they had truly done. They returned home as heroes, but the full story of their heroism remained untold. It wasn't until the 1990s that the mission was declassified, and the world finally learned about this incredible unit of battlefield elite. It's estimated that their deceptions saved anywhere from 15,000 to 30,000 Allied lives. They proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but an idea. The Ghost Army fought a different kind of war, a war of creativity and intellect. And their legacy is a testament to the power of human ingenuity in the face of conflict. In 2022, the members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest expression of appreciation. It was a long overdue recognition for the artists, actors, and engineers who used their unique talents to fool the enemy and help win the war. Imagine returning from the Second World War, hailed as a hero. Your family and friends gather around, desperate to hear your stories of bravery on the front lines. But you can't tell them. Not really. You can't tell them about the inflatable tanks you deployed under the cover of darkness, the phony radio transmissions you broadcast to confuse the enemy, or the elaborate soundscapes you created to mimic the rumble of an entire armored division on the move. You can't tell them you were part of one of the most brilliant and bizarre deception units in military history. This was the silent burden carried by the veterans of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. For more than half a century after the guns fell silent, their story was sealed away, locked in classified government archives. The official reason was national security. The techniques they pioneered were so effective, so revolutionary, that the U.S. military wanted to keep them under wraps, ready to be used again if needed. These methods of tactical deception, blending art and warfare, were considered a state secret of the highest order. So, the soldiers of the Ghost Army were sworn to silence. They went back to their lives, becoming artists, architects, designers, and businessmen. They lived next door to people who had no idea their quiet neighbor had once commanded an army of ghosts, fooling the German high command with little more than rubber speakers and sheer audacity. Think about the psychological weight of that. These men had saved thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of lives. Their deceptions drew enemy fire away from real troops, created phantom divisions that tied up German forces, and played a crucial role in key battles, from the beaches of Normandy to the final push across the Rhine River. Yet they couldn't take credit, They couldn't share the pride, the fear, the absurdity of it all. When other veterans swapped war stories at the local VFW post, the men of the Ghost Army had to stay quiet or offer vague, sanitized versions of their service. To their own children, they were simply soldiers who had served in Europe. The truth was just too secret to share. This silence wasn't just a suggestion. It was a legally binding order. Breaking it could have resulted in severe penalties, including imprisonment. These were men who had served their country with honor and ingenuity, and their reward was a lifetime of secrecy. It created a strange paradox. They were celebrated veterans, but the very essence of their contribution, the thing that made them so uniquely valuable, was completely unknown. It was as if their most significant accomplishment had been erased from their personal history. Many carried this secret to their graves, their families never knowing the full extent of their incredible wartime exploits. The lid finally began to lift in the mid-1990s. As the Cold War thawed and the veterans themselves entered their 70s and 80s, the U.S. government started declassifying the documents related to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. It was a slow trickle at first. A document here, a file there. Historians and researchers began piecing together the puzzle. What emerged was a story more incredible than any spy novel. It was a tale of artists and engineers turned soldiers of illusion. Men like fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, and photographer Art Kane were all part of this incredible unit. They had used their creative talents not to create beauty, but to create deception on a massive scale. The declassification revealed the sheer scope and detail of their operations. We learned about Operation Viersen, where they impersonated 2 entire U.S. divisions, comprising 30,000 men, to draw German forces away from a critical Rhine River crossing. They used a combination of hundreds of inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, coupled with sound trucks that blasted pre-recorded audio of troop movements and construction. They even created fake headquarters, complete with actors dressed as generals who would deliberately let themselves be seen by local spies. The German intelligence reports from the time confirmed their success, with commanders believing a massive American force was preparing to attack where, in reality, there was only a handful of creative soldiers and a lot of hot air. The declassified records also shed light on their sonic deception unit. This wasn't just playing random tank noises. It was a symphony of warfare. Audio engineers had gone to Fort Knox to record the specific sounds of different U.S. armored units. They created a massive sound library, cataloging everything from a single Jeep, starting up to an entire tank column moving out at night. On the battlefield, these sound experts would mix these tracks on wire recorders, creating a convincing auditory illusion that could travel up to 15 miles. They could make it sound like an infantry division was digging in for the night, or an armored battalion was assembling for a dawn raid. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, playing on the enemy's fears and expectations. The final piece of the puzzle was the radio deception. The Ghost Army's signal company mastered the art of spoof radio. They would mimic the unique Morse code, fist or typing style of other units' radio operators. When a real unit left the line, the Ghost Army would move in and take over their radio traffic, making it seem like the unit had never left. This convinced German intelligence that divisions were in one place when they were actually miles away, secretly moving to a new position for an attack. It was a subtle, meticulous, and highly effective form of misdirection. As these stories came to light, the surviving veterans, now elderly men, could finally speak. Documentaries were made, books were written, and museum exhibits were created. For the first time, they could share their unbelievable experiences with their families. With the world, you can see the relief and pride in their eyes in interviews from that time. Imagine, after 50 years, finally being able to tell your grandchild, Grandpa didn't just drive a truck in the war. He commanded a phantom army that tricked the enemy and saved lives. It was a long overdue recognition of their unique and vital contribution. The legacy of the Ghost Army is profound. It fundamentally changed how the military thought about warfare. It proved that creativity and imagination could be weapons just as powerful as bullets and bombs. The principles of psychological operations and tactical deception they pioneered are now standard doctrine in modern armies around the world. Every time you hear about information, warfare, or strategic misdirection in a modern conflict, you're hearing an echo of the Ghost Army's work. They were the original masters of fake news, but they used it for a noble cause, to minimize casualties and win a war for freedom. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through brute force, but through cleverness, courage, and a touch of theatrical magic. It took over 50 years for their curtain to rise, but the performance they gave has left a lasting mark on history. Have you ever heard of an army that fought with inflatable tanks, sound effects, and pure imagination? It sounds like something out of a Hollywood movie. But this was a real-life secret weapon during World War II. This is the incredible story of the Ghost Army, the masters of deception who saved thousands of lives without firing a single shot. In the final, brutal year of World War II, as Allied forces pushed toward Germany, they faced a determined and entrenched enemy. Every battle was costly, every life precious. The Allied command needed an edge, a way to outsmart the German war machine. The answer wasn't a bigger bomb or a faster plane. It was an idea to create a phantom force, an army of illusions that would trick the enemy into chasing shadows. This top-secret unit was officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But to history, they are remembered as the Ghost Army. The unit was a fascinating mix of talent. It wasn't filled with hardened combat veterans. Instead, the U.S. Army recruited artists, architects, sound engineers, actors, and designers from art schools and advertising agencies across America. These weren't your typical soldiers. They were creative minds whose mission was to use their artistic skills to deceive the enemy on a grand scale. Among them were future celebrities like fashion designer Bill Blass and artist Ellsworth Kelly. Their mission was so secret that their involvement was classified for more than 40 years after the war ended. Their battlefield was the human mind, and their weapons were perception and illusion. So how did they do it? The Ghost Army employed a brilliant, multi-layered strategy that they called spoofing. It was a symphony of deception, combining visual, sonic, and radio trickery. First, there was the visual deception. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers would roll into position, often under the cover of darkness, and inflate an entire army. They had a collection of over 1,000 inflatable rubber decoys, tanks, cannons, jeeps, trucks, and even airplanes. From a distance, especially from the air, these rubber dummies looked just like the real thing. A small team of soldiers could set up an entire armored division in a matter of hours, creating the illusion of a massive force ready to attack. They paid meticulous attention to detail, even creating fake tank tracks with special rollers to complete the illusion. But seeing is only one part of believing. The Ghost Army knew that an army makes noise. That's where the 3,132nd Signal Service Company came in. They were the sound wizards. These engineers had traveled to Fort Knox to record the sounds of entire armored and infantry units. They captured everything. The clatter of tank treads, the rumble of truck engines, the voices of soldiers, the clanking of equipment. They then took these recordings to the front lines and blasted them through powerful speakers, some so large they were mounted on They could simulate the sound of a column of tanks moving at night or an infantry division digging in, all with the turn of a dial. Imagine being a German soldier, hearing an entire armored division approaching your position in the dead of night. You'd report it up the chain of command, and the German generals would react, moving their own troops to counter a threat that wasn't even there. The final piece of the puzzle was radio deception, or what they called spoof radio. The signal company would mimic the radio traffic of a real military unit. They learned the unique radio habits of different operators, their particular way of tapping out Morse code, their slang, their chatter. They would then broadcast fake messages, creating a web of false information for German intelligence to intercept. They'd pretend to be a unit that was actually hundreds of miles away, convincing the enemy that an attack was coming from one direction while the real assault was being prepared elsewhere. By combining these three elements, inflatable decoys, sound effects, and fake radio traffic, the Ghost Army could impersonate a real U.S. Army unit that was up to 30 times its size. They could make the Germans believe a massive force was massing for an attack, drawing enemy divisions away from where the real Allied troops were planning to strike. To make the deception even more convincing, The Ghost Army had a theatrical element. Soldiers would drive a few trucks in loops to create the impression of a long convoy. They'd go into French towns, dressed as colonels and generals, and talk loudly in cafes about fake battle plans, knowing that local spies would overhear them. They even wore the patches of the units they were impersonating, and their jeeps and trucks bore the correct markings. It was a 24/7 performance, a piece of theater played out on the stage of war, where a single mistake could have been fatal. Their missions were incredibly dangerous. They were always on the front lines, often operating far ahead of the main Allied forces. With only light weapons to defend themselves, they were intentionally drawing enemy fire toward their positions. If their bluff was ever called, they would have been easily overrun. One of their most famous and critical missions was Operation V. In March 1945, the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River, a formidable natural barrier into the heart of Germany. A direct, massive assault would be incredibly bloody. The Ghost Army was called in to help. Their mission was to create a diversion, to convince the Germans that the crossing would happen at a different location, about 10 miles south of the real crossing point near a town called Vir. For 2 days, the Ghost Army put on their greatest performance. They deployed their entire arsenal of illusions. They inflated hundreds of rubber tanks and artillery pieces. They blasted the sounds of an army, preparing for a massive river assault. Their radio operators filled the airwaves with chatter simulating 2 full divisions, about 30,000 men. The deception was a resounding success. The German command fell for it completely. They trained their heavy artillery on the Phantom Army and repositioned their troops to counter the fake crossing. This left the actual crossing point for the Ninth Army lightly defended. When the real assault began, the Allies faced significantly less resistance than anticipated. Military historians estimate that the Ghost Army's deception saved anywhere from 10,000 to 30,000 American lives during that single operation. They had turned the tide of a major battle using nothing but creativity and courage. Across Europe, from the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine, the Ghost Army conducted over 20 battlefield deceptions. They were the secret weapon that Allied generals like George S. Patton used to confuse and misdirect the enemy, creating openings for real combat units to exploit. They were a mobile, flexible force that could create a phantom division one day and disappear the next, leaving the Germans bewildered and chasing ghosts. Their work was so secret that after the war, their records were classified and sealed. The men of the Ghost Army were sworn to secrecy, unable to tell even their families about their extraordinary exploits. They returned to civilian life, becoming artists, architects, and businessmen, their wartime heroics hidden from public view for decades. For years, their story was lost to history. But thanks to the efforts of historians and documentary filmmakers, their incredible contributions began to come to light. The men of the unit, now in their 80s and 90s, were finally able to share their stories. They spoke of the camaraderie, the creativity, and the constant danger they faced. They were proud of their unique service, knowing that they had fought the war in their own way, using their minds as their primary weapon. Finally, in 2022, their service received the recognition it so richly deserved. The United States Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. It was a long overdue tribute to the few hundred men whose ingenuity saved the lives of tens of thousands. Their legacy lives on, not just in the history books, but in modern military strategy. The principles they pioneered, deception, information, warfare, and psychological operations, are now central to how armies plan and fight. The Ghost Army proved that in war, imagination can be as powerful as firepower, and sometimes winning a battle is about convincing your enemy to fight shadows instead of soldiers. Their story is a powerful reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one you can't see.